This is episode 65 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Scott Farrell, director of the Chivalry Today educational program and one of the teaching artists with Intrepid Theater's Shakespeare for a New Generation school educational tour. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Presumably, they would have played together and gone to school together. In 1597, I think it was, there was a lawsuit in London involving these women, one of whom had grown up in Stratford, and she said that she had known the other woman in the lawsuit from school in Stratford. So that shows that these women had actually gone to school in Stratford around the time that Joan Shakespeare and William Shakespeare would have been growing up.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare grew up functioning as the oldest of his 5 siblings, with his parents losing 2 children before William was born. The stories of his brothers and sisters are brief, but as you might expect from the life of William Shakespeare, they are full of intrigue, mystery, and mirth. Here today to share with us the stories of Shakespeare's siblings is our guest, David Kathman. David holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and is a member of the Shakespeare Association of America, the Modern Language Association, and the Medieval and Renaissance Drama Society. He has completed extensive archival research focused on livery companies, apprenticeships, and places other than playhouses like inns and taverns where plays were performed in 16th century London. His articles and reviews on the history of William Shakespeare have appeared in Shakespeare Quarterly, Shakespeare Survey, Shakespeare Newsletter, Shakespeare Bulletin, Early Theater, and Research Opportunities in Medieval and Renaissance Drama, among many, many others. Learn more about David by visiting his website at shakespeareauthorship.com. Hello, David. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
How many siblings did William Shakespeare have?
Well, he was one of 8 children, although 3 of his sisters died in childhood. So he was one of 5 children who survived to adulthood. And he was the oldest of the survivors because he had 2 sisters who were baptized before he was, but one of them presumably died. We don't actually have a record of her burial, and then the other one died at the age of 2. He was the oldest surviving of 5 children.
Now, I know John and Mary Shakespeare had those 2 children that died in infancy, but what does it mean for William Shakespeare to have grown up functioning as the firstborn in his family?
It means he was the first surviving child and also the oldest male child. So that meant he had all the advantages that an oldest male child would have. He was seen as inheriting all the advantages that his father had. When his father officially got a coat of arms in the 1590s, it was really William who did that and was behind that. We assume. I mean, that's the way it was seen at the time. Technically, it was his father's coat of arms, but William used it. And then definitely after his father died in 1601, William was entitled to use that coat of arms as the eldest son.
So a lot of those typical oldest child type A symptoms going on for William Shakespeare there.
Yeah, and he would inherit his father's property. In the end, his father didn't really have much property to bequeath to him because William was much more successful. But, if his father had anything, he would sort of be as the eldest son, he would be the default person to inherit all that.
Now, I read that John and Mary Shakespeare reused the name Joan, which had been the name of one of the daughters they lost before William. The second Joan was born in 1569 when William was about 5 years old. Would she and William Shakespeare have grown up going to school together and playing alongside one another there in Stratford?
Well, presumably, yes. I mean, they were 5 years apart, so they were 5 years different in age, but presumably they would have played together and gone to school together. A lot of people assume that girls didn't go to school, but we actually do have evidence that girls did go to at least some schooling in Stratford. In 1597, I think it was, there was a lawsuit in London involving these women, one of whom had grown up in Stratford, and she said that she had known the other woman in the lawsuit from school in Stratford. So that shows that these women had actually gone to school in Stratford around the time that Joan Shakespeare and William Shakespeare would have been growing up. So there is evidence that girls did go to school in Stratford. It was probably a petty school that would have taught them to read and write, which was seen as a good thing so they could read and write, or at least read the Bible. Writing was taught after reading, but probably girls were at least taught to read so they could read the Bible.
Now, Joan is a rather significant person in Shakespeare's history because of her own place in his tale, since she would go on to outlive her older brother and then reside at Henley Street, or Shakespeare's birthplace, until her death. Do we know who she married or if she was close to William's children?
Well, she did marry a man named William Hart, who was a hatter. He made hats. We don't actually have a record of their marriage in the Stratford registers, but it was certainly before 1600 when their first child was baptized in Stratford. They had 4 children. One of those children actually has living descendants today, so they are the closest thing we have to descendants of William Shakespeare. His last direct descendant was his granddaughter, who died in 1680, I think it was. Elizabeth Barnard, yeah. She was his granddaughter. And so he has no living direct descendants, but there are quite a few descendants of Shakespeare's sister, Joan. So in that sense, she's an important person in the Shakespeare story.
Now, William had a brother named Edmund, who is recorded as going to London. Was Edmund an actor in Shakespeare's company?
Well, we know he was an actor. We don't know for sure whether he was an actor in Shakespeare's company. It's definitely tempting to think so, and I think it's entirely possible. We don't really have any evidence for that, but we do have 3 records of Edmund Shakespeare in London, and 2 of them involve a bastard child that he had in 1607. They're all from actually 1607. So in July of 1607, there's a record of Edmund Shakespeare having a son named Edmund, baptized in St. Leonard's, Shoreditch, which is a parish that's north of the city. That's where the theater was, where the curtain was. The theater had been one of the first custom-built playhouses in London, and then the curtain was another playhouse that was built soon after, and it was actually still around in the early 1600s. So it was a theatrical neighborhood in St. Leonard's, Shoreditch. There were a lot of theatrical people recorded in the registers there. That child was then buried a month later in St. Giles Cripplegate, which was to the west, and that was another theatrical parish where the Fortune Playhouse was located. And it was recorded as Edward, the son of Edward Shakespeare, player, base born. So that tells us that this Edward Shakespeare was a player, an actor, and also that the child was base born, meaning it was a bastard. He was not married to the mother.
Now, is it Edmund or Edward?
Well, the record says Edward, but the fact that there was a child, Edmund Shakespeare, son of Edmund Shakespeare, baptized a month earlier, suggests that this was just, a mistake by the scribe.
Okay.
Edward and Edmund were, seen as kind of interchangeable names. They weren't really, people in those days didn't really make the kind of fine distinctions we make today between names that are kind of similar. So you often see someone named Edmund called Edward or vice versa. So we assume, and I think it's pretty clear, that this was Edmund Shakespeare, whose child was buried in St. Giles Cripplegate after having been baptized a month earlier in St. Leonard's, Shoreditch. And then on New Year's Eve, 1607, December 31st, Edmund Shakespeare, he was also called a player in that record. He was buried at St. Saviour's, Southwark, which was the parish of the Globe Playhouse, and also the Rose Playhouse, which had closed a couple years before. And that was an area where a lot of members of Shakespeare's company lived, and it was another theatrical parish. So there are 3 records of Edmund Shakespeare in London, all of them in theatrical parishes, 2 of which call him a player.
Specifically call him a player. Now, when Edmund died, William financed the funeral. And I know we talked about William functioning as the oldest in his family, but was it normal for a brother to do that?
Well, we don't know for certain that William financed the funeral. I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption. One of the parish records said that the funeral came with a toll of the forenoon bell, and that it cost 20 shillings, which was a lot of money. I mean, that was a pound, and that was quite a bit of money. And so somebody with, who was pretty well off had financed it. Presumably that was Edmund's brother, William. I think it's a very reasonable assumption, but we can't be certain. And it was, people looked out for their family. So it would have been, reasonable for a brother to do something like that for his younger brother, especially when they were far from home. They were in London. They had both grown up in Stratford. And so people, certainly brothers and sisters would look out for each other, but also people who were not as closely related would, who were from the same town or the same area of the country would definitely look out for each other and help each other out if they needed to, especially in London, where there were people from all over the country.
Now, explain what the forenoon bell is. When we're saying he had this done and it was very expensive, what was it that happened at Edmund's funeral? What was the forenoon bell?
The forenoon bell would have been ringing the church bell of St. Saviour's Parish Church, which is now Southwark Cathedral. And it was something that was not done all that often. It was for special occasions.
So this wasn't something that everybody's funeral didn't have this.
Right. Most people's funeral did not have a toll of the forenoon bell or anything like that. It was a fairly elaborate funeral. And given that, Edmund's circumstances that we can tell from his other records, he appeared in 2 different parishes. He had a bastard child. He wasn't married to the mother. He was bouncing around London. He presumably wasn't very well off, but he had a brother who was. And so that's why people assume that William financed the funeral. And I think that, as I said, that's a reasonable assumption.
Why do you think William gave this much attention to Edmund and Edmund's funeral as opposed to all of his other siblings?
Well, for one thing, Edmund was in London. He had come to London with presumably following his brother. He was 16 years younger than William. Presumably he looked up to his brother, I assume, and wanted to follow in his footsteps. And Shakespeare he had 2 other brothers, Gilbert, who was 2 years younger than William, and Richard, who was also alive at the time. Both of them died bachelors, and both of them died in Stratford, so they were back at home. Gilbert actually does show up in a few London records. In 1597, he was apparently living in London as a haberdasher, and he was involved in a lawsuit where he was a surety for somebody from back in Stratford. But neither of them really did very much. Gilbert actually stood as sort of William Shakespeare's representative on a few transactions in 1602 when Shakespeare bought land in Old Stratford, which was an area near Stratford, the town. Gilbert served as his representative and, received the documents showing that he bought them because William presumably couldn't be there. So, his brother acted as his representative. But William spent most of his time in London, and so presumably he became close to Edmund, I would imagine. We're getting into speculation here, but I think it's pretty reasonable speculation that 2 brothers who were both in the theater business would have been pretty close, and William would have wanted to help out Edmund. And then when Edmund, had this bastard child who died at the age of 1 month, and that can't have been a fun experience for any of them. And then when Edmund himself died, William presumably wanted to, give him a good send-off and a good funeral. And so it makes sense that he would do these things for his brother who had followed him to London to get into the theater business.
Now, you mentioned this about Gilbert, but when I look him up, one of the only things I can find about him is that he was a haberdasher, which please explain for us what a haberdasher does and how do we know that this is what Gilbert did?
Well, a haberdasher sold hats and other sundries. A hatter would make the hats. A haberdasher would sell like hats and accessories, basically. Not like shirts and pants and stuff usually, but just
like cufflinks or something.
Things like that. Yeah,
okay.
like belts and hats and accessories for people, and just miscellaneous stuff, not just clothing, but miscellaneous stuff. And we know that because of that lawsuit I mentioned from 1597. He's called Gilbert Shakespeare Haberdasher, and it's a suit in London, but it involves a person back in Stratford, and that's why we can be reasonably sure that this is Gilbert Shakespeare from Stratford, because it involves a person from Stratford. And like I said, people in London would often be involved in various ways with people from their hometown or their home country, and there would often be lots of connections with people that you either knew or you just knew that they were from around where you were from. And so there isn't actually any record in the London Haberdashers Company of Gilbert Shakespeare. I've looked there, and I've looked through the haberdashers record. They're far from complete, so that doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't somehow a member of the company, but we haven't been able to find any record of him in the records that do survive. But that doesn't mean he couldn't have practiced as a haberdasher in London. Although we don't know how long he was in London. He may have just been there for a little while and then gone back to Stratford, because he did die in Stratford in 1612.
Now, William's remaining brother, Richard, he also grew to adulthood, but what was his trade?
We don't know anything about Richard, basically, other than
he existed. Okay.
Well, we know that he was baptized and in Stratford, and then he died in Stratford at the age of 38, just short of 39. There's only one other record of him, and it's from, I think, 1608 or something. It's just a lawsuit in one of the ecclesiastical courts where he was just named as one of the numerous people who were a party to the suit, but we don't really know anything about, what the suit was about, and we don't know anything about what he did for a living. We don't have any record of him getting married, so presumably he was just a bachelor. We don't know what he did. There's no record of him anywhere other than Stratford and the Stratford area. So that's not all that unusual for unmarried men of that era, because a lot of the records we have involve marriage and children and stuff. And if somebody didn't get married, there often will just be very little record of them.
Well, then I think there might not be enough record to answer my next question, but I was curious about William Shakespeare's siblings in terms of whether they followed a similar career path as William. We think of William Shakespeare as having left school and kind of gone to London without participating in an apprenticeship program and striking out on his own to make a career. Do we have any record as to whether his other brothers and sisters, or I suppose just his brothers, because I don't think the sisters would have done an apprenticeship thing, but if the brothers skipped that too and started their own career, or did they finish school?
Well, we don't have any record of what they did in terms of schooling. There are no records of who the students were at the Stratford Grammar School. We know that it existed and that the masters were paid a pretty good salary. And, we assume that William went there because he was entitled to. His father was an alderman, a fairly big shot in the town. He was high bailiff for a while when Shakespeare was about 5 or 6 years old, and that was the equivalent of mayor. It was like the highest civic office. So, and that was about the time that William would have been going to petty school to learn how to read and write. And presumably he went to the Stratford Grammar School, and presumably his brothers did too. Now, Gilbert, we do have a signature of his from a deed in 1609, I think it is, and he wrote in a nice, neat italic hand, Gilbert Shakespeare. So he got some pretty good teaching and penmanship. He wrote in an italic hand. It's interesting because William Shakespeare wrote in secretary hand. All of his signatures are in secretary hand. The signatures on his will and the words by me, and also the 3 pages of the play Sir Thomas More, which pretty much everybody now agrees are in William Shakespeare's handwriting. That's in secretary hand. That was sort of the old-fashioned way of writing, and italic hand was closer to the cursive we write today, and it was sort of the newer version, and it was sort of the hip version that like the upper class would use. And it's interesting to see Gilbert writing in italic hand, signing his name in italic hand, and William consistently writing in secretary hand. Given that they were only 2 years apart in age, it's not really an age thing. So I don't know what that means for sure, but Gilbert was maybe putting on some airs, trying to be a little fancier than William, but we don't know for sure.
Just another exciting mystery in the tale of William Shakespeare.
There are many mysteries in Shakespeare's life.
Well, we would love to explore some of these mysteries further and to learn more about William Shakespeare's siblings. Do you have any favorite books or resources that you might recommend where we can go to learn more?
Well, there's always Sam Schoenbaum's William Shakespeare, A Documentary Life, and also a compact documentary life, which is a version of the same book, but without all the illustrations, because the documentary life has illustrations of most of the documents involving Shakespeare's life. That's over 40 years old, but it's still a very good source for a lot of the key facts about Shakespeare's life. It doesn't speculate very much. Some of the speculation he does do is maybe a little out of date, or I wouldn't necessarily agree with it. But you can't go too far wrong with Schoenbaum. There are also lots of biographies of Shakespeare, too many to really name, that I could go into. But there are lots of them. Lois Potter wrote a good one a few years ago. Park Honan wrote one in the late 90s, which is a very good one, I think, and actually goes into some things that other biographies don't necessarily go into. That's called Shakespeare, a Life, I think it is. There's obviously a lot written about Shakespeare's life, and any of those are a good place to start.
Excellent. Well, we'll link to those in today's show notes. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh boy, what book would I take on a desert island? That's a very good question, and boy, it's hard to pick just one. I have over 5,000 books, so it would be hard to choose just one of them. One that has been one of my favorite fiction books since I read it in high school was Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. I mean, I just love that book just for the language and for the sarcastic manner, and it's considered one of the first novels in English. I might take that just to read it and reread it a few times, but if I really had to just choose one, I might choose that, but there are lots of others I could just as easily say.
Excellent choice. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've been doing a lot of research on inns and taverns and other places other than playhouses where plays were performed in London in Shakespeare's time and somewhat earlier. I'm working on a book on that, and I don't know when it'll be done. I've been working on it for a while, but I've got a lot of research to put into it. And some of the material has been published in various places, but there's a lot more that I need to get into print. And that's sort of the main thing. I've also continued to do a lot of research on the biographies of theater people from Shakespeare's time, including John Hemmings and Henry Condell, the two guys who edited the first folio edition of Shakespeare's works. I found new documentary evidence about both of their lives in the last 15 years. I love doing that. I love going to London and doing research in the archives. I found a lot of material. I also have a biographical index of English theater before 1660, which is online and available for anybody. It's at shakespeareauthorship.com/BD for biographical dictionary. There's also the Shakespeare authorship website, which is on the same server. That's shakespeareauthorship.com, all one word. That refutes the people who say that William Shakespeare didn't write the works of Shakespeare, because those people are wrong. And I show on that website, along with some other people, why those people are wrong and don't have any idea what they're talking about.
Well, I'm glad you clarified, because I was going to explain that as well. But yes, actually, I am very impressed with your website. I love spending time there. Learning all that you've compiled over there is quite extensive. And I'm excited about the Biographical Index of English Theater. We'll definitely link to that and your website in the show notes for today. Well, David Kathman, thank you so much for being here this week and for talking with us about Shakespeare and his siblings. I know I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you being here today.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Find links where you can see Shakespeare's handwriting samples that David talked about in today's episode, as well as more history on Gilbert, Joan, Richard, and Edmund inside the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 65. That's CassidyCash.com/EP65. If you like the history you're learning here on the show, consider supporting us the way William Shakespeare himself was supported, by becoming an official patron of That Shakespeare Life. For just $5 a month, you can unlock great benefits and members-only resources at CassidyCash.com/member. That's CassidyCash.com/member. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.